I want to help you in all earthly and spiritual adversity so that you believe in my love, in my wisdom and might. For I love you, my living creations, infinitely, and I also want to gain your love. I know of your adversity and also how to end it, and I have the power to do so. I gladly demonstrate my love, wisdom and might to children who turn to their Father and trustingly appeal to Him for His consideration and help. I want to eliminate your earthly and spiritual adversity, yet occasionally I demand your patience in earthly hardship, for only I know why it had to happen to you. But I will take it from you. However, anyone experiencing spiritual adversity will not have to wait long, for as soon as he calls upon me to consider him I will already be willing to help. Spiritual adversity consists of psychological weakness, thus a diminished will, spiritual darkness and constantly recurring doubts. Spiritual adversity is my opponent's activity and influence, who very frequently especially dares to tackle people who are already my own and whom he wants to get back under his control. And as long as the human being lives on earth he will try to exert his influence, intending to weaken him time and again. Yet as soon as the person turns to me he will displace my adversary, and I will let my strength flow and give the person light and perception. I will fulfill his request to avert his spiritual hardship. You should know that it is my adversary's intention to extinguish the bright radiance of the light of truth which penetrates everywhere and disperses the region of darkness where only my adversary is able to work. Thus he will try to extinguish the light. He will want to cast shadows across it by raising doubtful questions in the person and thereby intending to obscure the light of awareness. But I will not allow the latter. Instead, my light of truth from above will shine down even more brightly, and the light he tried to obscure will illuminate the night even more. And wherever a shadow still exists it will be consumed by the all-permeating light from me, for nothing dark can endure this light. And thus the eternal light itself will proclaim to you, you, who are living on earth, as well as all spirits which once had lived an earthly life as a human being. You are the once fallen spirits, with few exceptions, for beings of light also embody themselves on this earth. Thus beings from the kingdom of light descend to you humans in order to assist you in serious spiritual hardship. Therefore you must differentiate between spirits having fallen away from God and original spirits remaining with God. The former exist in the abyss as followers of my adversary and the latter stay with me in all perfection. Furthermore, you have to differentiate between beings which still harbor the adversary's will within themselves and those which have already entered into my will but are not yet perfected and therefore are still subject to his influence. And then you will be able to understand that the latter need to be helped because they are too weak to resist his influence. Thus the mission of these beings of light, which also voluntarily embody themselves on earth in order to help them, will be explicable to you too. And then you will also comprehend the mission of the human being Jesus, who, as such a being of light, wanted to accomplish a rescue mission which defeated my adversary's power. All were children of my love, the fallen beings as well as those remaining with me, but the beings did not stay the same, they had become different now. They were radiant and dark beings which could not stay in the same spheres together. And thus the kingdom of light and the kingdom of darkness became the abode for these different natured beings. And no bridge existed between these two realms until the arrival of Jesus, one of my remaining angel spirits, who wanted and succeeded in bridging this distance through a unique act of compassion. The beings which once had lost their perfection due to their rebellion against me required someone to help them, since they were too weak by themselves even though the connection had been established, for my adversary also had great power which he was able to use against his former followers. But the beings which had stayed with me were strong too, since they constantly let themselves be permeated by the strength of my love. Thus the strength of a non-fallen angel spirit would have fully sufficed in order to achieve victory over my adversary and to save his followers from him. Yet this contradicted my law of eternal order, Given that the free will of all beings which once had followed my adversary would have been ignored, and such an attained victory would have prevented the beings from becoming perfect? Consequently, another way had to be found. Love had to make a sacrifice, and it had to be every fallen being's decision to avail itself of this sacrifice, thus to wish that it was also made for itself. But only a human being can offer a sacrifice. A being of light can indeed have the will to sacrifice itself, but in that case it has to render it as a human being, for a being of light is unable to suffer and also has so much strength at its disposal that it is able to do anything. A human being, however, is a weak, imperfect being and sensitive to suffering and torment, which needs to muster a vast amount of willpower when it voluntarily accepts sufferings and torments in order to achieve something, not for itself but for its fellow human beings, and which wants to bestow its love on the wretched human race. It had to make the sacrifice as a mere human for its fellow human beings. It had to be capable of suffering and dying. And thus you will understand that the human being called Jesus was not allowed to demonstrate any advantages which would characterize him as an extraordinary person, even though his soul was a spirit of light. Although it had not passed through creation like the human beings' souls, the fallen brothers, nevertheless, this soul, when it entered the body of flesh, which, like other people's bodies, was a cluster of immature spiritual substances, thus also subject to the same feelings, longings and passions, had to learn to overcome these as Jesus the human being during his earthly life. For his mission, apart from the salvation, the redemption of the gravest guilt of sin, was to exemplify to people the only way of life which would guarantee them a return to me. Thus, if people who were completely inadequate, weak and captivated by passions were asked to do something, it should be possible for them to accomplish this request. And if the man Jesus wanted to serve as an example, he had to be just like his fellow human beings. His extraordinary origin, like that of the embodied beings of light on earth which want to be of help to people, by no means infers unusual abilities or advantages which would have required a less stringent fight with himself in order to thus find unification with me on earth, which is the goal and task of every human being on earth and for which the man Jesus set the example that it can be achieved. All the advantages Jesus had as a spirit of light he surrendered before his incarnation as a human being, or his work could not have been what it is, a sacrifice made by love, the blessing of which should benefit all people. But neither can it ever be denied that God himself made this sacrifice because love was the determining factor which so infused the human being Jesus that I thus was able to be in him after he, as a human being, had voluntarily shaped himself such that I could take abode in him, that he became a vessel for me, and thus he then possessed strength and light in abundance. Which again is a process that could not just take place in Jesus the human being but which all people should and are able to achieve because they now have help through the divine Redeemer Jesus Christ. Since due to his act of salvation as a human being he gained an amount of grace which is now available to every person. And anyone who avails himself of it will also reach the goal. He will likewise find unification with me on earth. He will be able to receive light and strength without limitation. However, you shall continue to receive clarification, because as long as questions arise anew it is also necessary to provide you with the correct answer. And the more sincerely you desire this answer, the sooner you will receive it. The souls evolving from the abyss can expect, as the last stage of their development on earth, to be embodied as a human being. Then the process of development will be completed and the soul will enter the spiritual realm, irrespective of how it is shaped when it discards its physical shell. Hence these souls proceed in accordance with divine order. They release themselves from hard matter by way of service and yet rise gradually. Souls of light embodied on earth, however, only descend to earth for the purpose of a mission. They take abode in the human body straight away, but then they indeed travel their earthly path like every other person and are thus also subject to natural law and equally have to struggle on earth. their external shell will make the same demands on them, because it is composed from still completely immature spiritual substances, from tiny particles of the soul of a once fallen original spirit which is still in utter opposition to God and which first has to be pacified and changed by the soul, which is always a struggle. The soul is not conscious of its earlier state of light. The earthly body has caused its own darkening. Only love will arise sooner and more intense in such a person and disperse the darkness more rapidly too. A soul from above will also always turn its eyes upwards towards God, whom it very quickly learns to recognize. Such a soul will usually not need a long time to unite itself with the divine spark within, which can easily influence it, and then spirit and soul will try and succeed to influence their external shell too. Still, the fact that the soul is traveling the path across earth is always associated with the self-evidence that the soul has to fight, because it constantly has to overcome obstacles in this earthly material world in order to reach the spiritual goal. Thus no soul is able to ascend without pain, not even a soul of light, since at the beginning of its incarnation it had descended into the abyss, into a state of ignorance, of constraint and weakness. This should therefore always be taken into consideration when the earthly life of an embodied being of light is assumed to be an easy one. The earthly body is and remains a shackle for the soul until it leaves it. And yet even the body can still vary. The flesh can still be steeped in sin, thus still incorporating much of Lucifer within itself if it is born out of sin, if the people creating a new life are only controlled by satanic attributes. And then again, a being, newly awakened into life, may owe its life to two people's urge to love. Predominantly good instincts could therefore also have entered this being, and thus the external shell will be appropriately natured. It will carry much of the genetic makeup within itself and more or less has to fight hard in earthly life and therefore also arrive at its goal with more or less difficulty. Yet no human being's earthly existence remains without struggle. A light being's earthly life is in fact frequently exceptionally difficult, because the soul unconsciously experiences its stay in the earthly world as a torment and, for the sake of its mission, often also accepts a very arduous earthly fate. The process of procreation is now, due to Adam's failure, unblessed, for it did not correspond to God's will, who wanted to give the first human couple his blessings at the right time. Lucifer participated in the procreation of the people, and he will never relinquish this right, granted to him through Adam's will, either. He will always participate in the emergence of new life, even if people's degree of love can keep him at bay to a point and God's protection against him is requested. And now you will understand that God himself, however, opposes his adversary, when he creates a bodily shell for himself which he wants to take possession of himself one day and which should already serve him as an abode at the time of birth. For God himself will never ever unite with his adversary in his activity. And likewise he will not allow the natural carrier of his shell to be taken over by his adversary. For he, the God and Creator of eternity, who brought everything into being, who assigned purpose and destiny to everything, truly has the power to externalize from himself everything he wants. Thus it will surely also be possible for him to bring forth a human being without the lawful act of procreation, and it will also truly be possible for him to keep his adversary at bay until his will is done. For God only takes shelter inside a pure cover, he will not unite with something impure. Which, however, does not exclude that the human being in this kingdom of imperfection, in the kingdom belonging to his adversary, is nevertheless subject to all harassments and that his earthly progress is therefore no less anguished and full of conflict like that of his fellow human beings. For without fight there could be no victory. God's adversary, however, had to be defeated, and Jesus truly won the most arduous battle which ever was fought on earth. And he won it as a human being, not as God. Amen.